You've probably heard the chatter, right? It seems like everywhere you turn, there's this growing conversation that that men in the modern world are falling behind. But is this a real, measurable crisis? Or is it maybe just a lot of media hype? To figure that out, we have to look past the headlines and dig into the actual data.
Okay, let's start with a really tough one. This is probably the most sobering statistic of all. In the United States, men die by suicide at more than 4 times the rate of women. Just think about that for a second. This isn't a small gap, it's a massive chasm. It points to a level of despair that we just can't ignore, and it's really the first, most urgent piece of this entire puzzle.
And look, this isn't just about mental health. It's also deeply, deeply economic. As the author Scott Galloway points out here, for the very first time in American history, today's 30-year-olds are not doing as well as their parents were at that same age. You know, that foundational promise that each generation will do better than the last, that seems to be breaking down. And it feels like it's hitting young men particularly hard.
So what does this struggle actually look like on the ground? Well, researchers have a name for the feeling behind all these statistics. They call it a state of precarity, which is basically a life that feels completely defined by instability.
This chart, wow, this really shows a staggering disconnect. Since 1990, the rate of young men who are neither in school nor working has literally doubled. Doubled. So today, that means 1 out of every 10 young men is completely untethered from the 2 traditional pillars of early adulthood, education and employment. They're just adrift.
And this feeling, this sense of being adrift, unstable, insecure, that's what experts mean by precarity. It's not just about not having money. It's this deep, gnawing uncertainty about your entire future. And that kind of uncertainty can make young men really vulnerable to some pretty dangerous ideologies and online rabbit holes. Okay, so beyond the economic data, there's a really powerful cultural idea at play here. And to get our heads around it, we need to go inside what researchers call the man box. So what is the man box? Well, you can think of it as this set of really rigid, traditional expectations for men. You know the script. Be tough, never show emotion, be the sole provider, always be in control. It's this super restrictive set of rules for what it means to be a man, and, as we'll see, it comes with some pretty profound consequences.
Now you might be thinking, okay, that's just old-fashioned stuff, right? Like grandpa's generation. But look at this data. It shows these ideas are surprisingly popular among younger men. On this chart, across a whole range of statements about traditional gender roles, it's often millennial men who show the highest levels of agreement. So yeah, these views are very much alive and well.
And what's the result of living inside this box? Well, it's profound isolation. The very same study found that a staggering 2/3 of young men agree with the statement, "No one really knows me." That's just a quiet, heartbreaking admission of deep loneliness hidden behind that tough facade. All right, this next part, this is where things get really counterintuitive. We're about to dive into what I'm calling the purpose paradox. It's a finding that honestly seems to contradict everything we've just been talking about when it comes to the harms of this restrictive masculinity. Okay, let's break this chart down together. On the far right, you've got the men who most strongly agree with those man box ideas, and the rows represent their sense of purpose in life. Now just look at that top right square. A full 34% of the men who are the most inside the man box also report having the most sense of purpose. That is the highest number on the entire grid.
So here it is, plain and simple. The very same ideas that seem to isolate men and cause all this harm are also, for some of them, providing the clearest sense of purpose. That's the paradox right at the heart of this crisis. It seems that while these rigid roles can be really damaging, they also offer a simple, clear-cut script for how to live your life, a script that a lot of men seem to be craving in a very confusing world.
This whole paradox just forces a huge question, doesn't it? Why? Why are so many men drawn to these old scripts? What's creating this feeling of precarity in the first place? Let's take a look at some of the root causes that experts have been pointing to.
So experts really point to a perfect storm of factors. You've got these major economic shifts that are making old markers of success, like owning a home, feel totally out of reach. In education, boys are steadily falling behind girls. Technology, which promised us all this connection, is often creating this deep, deep isolation. And then there's the decline of real-world third spaces, like community centers or clubs, which has left a lot of men with just nowhere to go to connect.
Let's just zoom in on one of these for a second. Home ownership. It's the classic symbol of stability, right? 30 years ago, the median age for a first-time homebuyer was 28. Today, it's 38.
When a key part of that traditional male script gets delayed by a full decade, it's no surprise that it feeds so directly into that feeling of precarity. And on the technology front, Richard Reeves just puts it perfectly. Danger lurks more from an algorithm than an alleyway. The threats have totally changed. It's not just physical anymore, it's digital. These radicalizing algorithms and the isolation of living your life online can be way more destructive than any street corner ever was. Okay, so we've seen the data, we've looked at the cultural context and some of the potential causes, but now it's time to pull the lens back a bit. Because not everyone actually agrees that crisis is the right word to use here. There's a really fierce debate about how we should be framing this entire issue.
And this brings us to the central question. Are we looking at a genuine, data-driven crisis that demands totally new solutions? Or are we in the middle of a moral panic, kind of overreacting to an issue, and in the process, ignoring other crucial parts of the story?
Let's look at the two sides here. The crisis view points right to the hard data. Men are falling behind in key areas, and that ends up harming everyone. But the critical view pushes back. It argues that, hey, loneliness isn't unique to men. Women have been facing these same economic struggles for decades, and framing it as a male crisis lets men off the hook for personal responsibility.
This comment, from a Reddit user of all people, just captures that critical perspective so perfectly. It's a really sharp question that cuts right to the heart of the debate. If men are supposed to be leaders and problem solvers, why is fixing their own social life suddenly someone else's responsibility?
And that brings us to the final, central question of all this. After seeing the data, hearing the debates, who is ultimately responsible for helping men catch up? Is this a systemic problem that society needs to solve with new policies and new structures? Or is it a challenge of personal accountability that men need to solve for themselves? The real answer is probably somewhere in the middle, and that very question is what's at the heart of this entire debate.